will basically go through a presentation, and we will do as well a demo with my colleague Jean-Baptiste. First of all, what is secondary data review in the humanitarian sector? So it's obviously data that is obtained by somebody else. So it's not our data collection that has been conducted at the field level. It is basically data that has already gone through one layer of analysis, and we'll get there later on when I'll introduce to you as well what do we refer to analysis when it comes to the humanitarian ecosystem. And it's as well data that is used for different purposes. And you can have a data set that has been already used in a previous scope of study, and we are basically going to take that data and use it for another purpose. So basically, we refer to secondary data review as it being a research technique that is basically used to create more of a clear analytical scope using information that is coming from other relevant sources. And basically, in the ecosystem of the humanitarian world, for us, we refer to as an analyst, and that's where it's interesting for the Data Fest, because you might have a lot of other colleagues that are data analysts, but what we refer to is basically the person that is able to collate all those pieces together and give as much as possible a coherent picture on that specific topic. And so we really need to be able to synthesize and summarize a lot of data, a lot of information, to be able to hand it over to decision makers in the humanitarian ecosystem and in humanitarian organizations for them to take timely and structured decisions within the landscape of information that is existing today. This is what happens when a disaster occurs. This is the ratio of data that is basically split between secondary and primary data. And the first 72 hours, and even before, especially when we're looking at a natural disaster like a cyclone or an earthquake or other elements that are naturally driven, we really have the majority of the data that is really focusing on secondary data. Then once we have the teams arriving on the ground, we have the whole financial mechanism being put in place, we can start using our resources on the ground to start collecting primary data. But the first real snapshot of the situation on the ground is really given by secondary data. Here we can see what is the ratio between pre-crisis data, in-crisis data, and again, primary data that is being collected on the ground after a shock has occurred in a given context. And again, the secondary data component is really looking at historic pre-crisis data as much as possible. Try to complement and triangulate with the data that is coming in after a shock has occurred, but a lot is relying, especially the first week, on data that is already existing. It's already there. It's already on the web. It's already on reports. It's already existing, and we don't need to necessarily have massive field data collection exercises because we can rely a lot on the first week on secondary data information. How do we do this? Well, we will basically explore the tool that is called Deep, which basically is an open source platform. It's an interagency joint initiative, and I'll get there just in a moment. And the objective of the tool is really to be able to facilitate the process of secondary data analysis. We don't expect to have a tool that is going to solve the human-induced processes, and we really just want to make sure that we have a tool, a platform, a system that can actually reinforce the messaging and the whole analytical workflow that is in support of situation and risk analysis for major humanitarian crisis. One key point to mention is that it's a platform built by analysts for analysts. So to be quite frank, it's not necessarily going to be very user-friendly at the very beginning. There's quite some elements that are, somehow forced to have, such as the analytical framework. If you do not have an analytical framework, or you do not know how to use an analytical framework, and we will get there in the next slides, basically Deep, the entry page and the homepage of Deep is empty. And we aim really to make sure that we can deliver on a timely manner qualitative and quantitative credible analysis. And we will basically give you a quick overview on the presentation on how deep looks like, but we will as well do a live demo, and we will show you as well a specific case study of an ongoing humanitarian project on how actually this is applicable. So as I mentioned, the word interagency joint initiative, it's because the governance board of DEEP is composed by all these organizations that you see on the screen. It exists since 2016. It is a flat structure, meaning that the board is responsible for taking any of the decisions related to the platform and the application itself, and how do we really want to mainstream humanitarian secondary data analysis using DEEP. And it's growing, and so the emphasis of the application now is really on trying to make the rollouts at the operation and field levels. We went through since 2016 through various iterations of pilots and case studies, but now we are really reaching the level of full rollout and implementation. So DEEP, we will look at the challenge that it's trying to solve. What is the solution that is proposed, how the platform looks like, and then we will explore the machine learning and natural language processing techniques that are as well now being integrated in the brain of our Kraken. So the challenges, I mean, as you can imagine, being on the data fest, and you probably all are data gurus, the key issue we have as of today is really to extract the information that is existing. What is actually making sense out of it today? Maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had a challenge that we had to collect a lot of information to try to get that picture that gives us a common overview and a common sense of what is happening on a humanitarian landscape. But as of today, we really need to just be able to filter among all the multiple sources and documents that are existing. The information is even too much sometimes, and we really need to make sure on how do we make sense of all the information that is existing through a common analytical framework. This is what we believe with the DEEP governance board is the gap that needs to be filled. We want to invert this. We want to invert this curve. We tend to over collect. We tend to analyze very little, and we over report. We over generate products that don't necessarily have analytical values in the humanitarian sector. And we really want to switch this graph where we need to collect what is needed, analyze as much as possible, and again, report what is aligned to the requirements and what is actually needed. So the solution that we're proposing is to structure secondary data analysis using DEEP and through the principles that I will introduce just now. So DEEP initiated in 2015 after the Nepal earthquake, and at that time it was purely done in terms of secondary data on an Excel spreadsheet, and sometimes if it was more of a bigger group that had to be coordinated and brought together, was done through Google spreadsheets, and that's what we refer to SIDR, which is Secondary Information Data Review. In the Nepal operation, then the team that was at that time led by the UN Disaster and Assessment Coordination team on the ground, and there was as well a team of ACAPs that was deployed, which is a joint interagency project focusing on analysis. Started basically structuring a web-based application, and that's where we start seeing the first iterations of DEEP, and that's where we start rolling out pilots, and we start rolling out case studies on how the processes should improve. And this is as well where we start looking at training and guidance material on all the core elements that we look at when we're referring to structured analytical techniques. And then in the second phase is basically in between is where we have the DEEP governance board coming together. So those stakeholders that I showed you just before, and that's where basically we start improving the user experience, and we start basically having a more coherent web-based application that everybody buys in. And then in the last phase of 2019, that's where we started integrating the machine learning and NLP functionalities. And so that's where basically you can see the evolution of the brain of the Kraken starting to take life. It's still at its infancy stages, we're still learning and teaching how the brain should continue improving and becoming more and more smart, but we will get there just later on. This is how in the humanitarian ecosystem analysis is basically perceived. And these are the steps and the layers that are needed to go through in terms of the analysis workflow. Obviously, it is based on time and how much energy and brain thought process you invest in. So the less time you have and the less brain power you focus and allocate to your analysis, then obviously you're going to be at the very bottom left corner, where you're basically not necessarily going to be able to come with analytical conclusions that are going to be insightful and going to be able to select and help decision makers take often life-saving decisions. So basically we have the exploratory, descriptive, explanatory, interpretative, anticipatory, and prescriptive analysis phases. And the ones that are really key are starting from the explanatory and the interpretative levels of analysis. And that's where shared analysis comes into action. If I am doing analysis in Geneva or in Beirut for a context that is 5,000 kilometers away from where I am sitting, from a scientific model, I can actually make it very relevant. And it is evidence-based and it has tangible outputs and outcomes, which makes sense. But if we do not share the analysis, if the collective brains of all those engaged in analysis in the humanitarian ecosystem don't get together to really explain why and how come things are happening or have happened, and how can these actually steer and change direction, we often will still have very good products, but often the individual levels of analysis are very basic and have as well a lot of bias that is a core element of our human nature that will then basically not necessarily be the most accurate type of analytical outputs that we would be expecting to be able to obtain in the humanitarian ecosystem. The other element that is crucial is the structuring of an analytical framework. And this is an analytical framework from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And basically we will dive in on how frameworks operate and what do they actually mean. But if we want to vulgarize in brackets what it actually means for humanitarian information analysis, it's basically in the IT world, this would basically be your database structure. You will never have an IT architect that will come to you and develop a website or a web-based application if the first thing you do not structure is your database architecture. And what we are introducing is really to have this framework so that we know exactly what we want to collect. How do we want to filter the data? How do we really want to structure the data into a web-based application so that we can have historic trends and we can really use the data in a coherent and streamlined manner. So for us, analytical frameworks are really important so that we can, structure the data analysis plan. I often had in situations where organizations would ask 80, 70 questions on the ground. And then when we do the analysis, when we do the final analytical output, we would use only 10 of those questions. And so we really want to change that way of thinking so that we basically can really ask to the communities that have been affected by a specific disaster, the right questions, the questions that we know we will be using for our levels of analysis. And basically that's where frameworks really come into action to define as well the type of the analytical conclusions that need to be reached and agreed among the humanitarian community. And as well, it will help you structure the final analytical output. The platform, and as I said, we will give you a demo quite shortly. Basically, this is how we used to do secondary data in the past. This is the Excel spreadsheet that I was referring to. Each individual would, read a document on the web and go put into the spreadsheet. And then there's all your pillars of your framework outlined as columns in your spreadsheet. and then the analyst will compile all of this information and add all the metadata that is linked to the piece of information and the report that we are assigning it to, and then the analysts, obviously, that are trained and the experts in the domain of the humanitarian ecosystem, then can rate as well the reliability of the source and the severity of the piece of information, which is one of the key elements that we really need to try to capture, because we really want to make sure that we are going to provide analytical outputs that can support decision-making processes for those who are most in need after a sudden onset or disaster or a crisis has occurred. So in Deep, we can input documents and we can input all sorts of formats. There's even now a Google Chrome extension that, you know, whatever you're reading on the web, you can just capture and ingest in Deep. It will basically apply, and I'll show it to you later on with a demo, a Python scraper that is going to basically simplify your view of the document, removing all of the layouts, and then you do the tagging process against your analytical framework, and then you can export the document, your results in multiple document formats, and you have as well an API that you can connect to other business intelligence software solutions, so that you can actually do the analysis directly in Tableau, Power BI, or other BI solutions. So the first thing we need to do is to create a project and a framework. We need to assign to the project a framework. If we do not want or have the ability to create a framework because we do not have the time, or we do not have the overall exposure to the principles of how to define a humanitarian analytical framework, there is a repository of already existing frameworks that users can select and can actually use. So basically, this is here on the left, you can see that there is a screenshot of all the frameworks that are there, and then you can assign and create your project, and then, you know, you can assign users to it, and what are the different roles that each user would have and expect to have in the project itself. Once we have that defined, we go and we look for documents. We call them leads in Deep. And basically, we can import RSS feeds. We can connect directly to a Dropbox folder or Google Drive. If we have documents hosted on a local hard drive, we can do that as well. And through a Chrome extension, we can capture everything that is available on the web. And obviously, we can always just ingest manual text formats in Deep. These are the types of document formats that we can actually ingest and process. So everything that is related to Microsoft Office, PowerPoint, Word, Excel can go into Deep, PDF as well, websites, manual text, text formats, files, and as well images. So even if you have an image, we can actually ingest it into the system, and we can use the reference of the image against our framework for generating our analytical output at the end of the day. And once we have ingested the document itself, you know, like the PDF report of UNICEF, we can basically then allocate pieces of information that we are reading on our documents to our analytical framework. So here you have a screen capture that shows you on the left how the original document looks like. This is a news article from Bangladesh. And then the analyst would have to go through the document itself, read it, and whenever there is any information that is relevant for the context of Bangladesh and to the framework, we basically would just highlight the piece of text and just simply drag and drop the text inside the relevant boxes of the framework. As you can see, there's the bidimensional layer on the top, and then there's a three-layer dimensions on the bottom, because you can actually break it down by specific humanitarian sectors, so that you can actually really start digging into the details of the metadata of each piece of information. The more metadata we add to the piece of information, the more we are structuring the database, and that will give us as well more options for the export functionality, and will give more granularity to the next and final step, which is basically having the analysts come through other structured analytical techniques to the final analytical output. And then we are working on automating it. So this is just a screenshot of how we are basically moving Deep from being just purely a database structure system for qualitative and quantitative information, but we're really making Deep smarter. So as of today, our NLP functionalities can give us basically the automated tagging process for all what is related to humanitarian sectors, and as well geographic scope. So if I write health infrastructure has been damaged in Italy, for example, I'm from Italy, so I can use that as a country for this example. The system will tell you, well, this is looking at health and is looking at Italy as a country. And basically the user then at that point will just have to do a thumbs up, thumbs down to basically continue validating the algorithms that are behind the machine learning methodologies that are applied in Deep, but we will get there in more details with Jean-Baptiste. And then the export functionality. This is how an export snapshot looks like. This is basically just a snapshot of one page, depending on the number of documents and pieces of information that have been ingested in the system. We will basically be able to filter according to all the requirements that we want. And depending on the filter layers that we apply, then obviously as well, the size of the export will have different dimensions. And as you can see, the context in this specific case is one of your pillars of your framework, and politics and security is one of your sub-pillars of your framework. And so again, Deep will automatically structure the document in a coherent manner, linked once again to your analytical framework. And then we have inside Deep all sorts of levels of analysis and dashboards that are all interactive, that you can play around with them to understand a bit what is available in a specific country in terms of data, in terms of needs assessments, in terms of reports that are available in the application, so that you can really then tailor your queries and your requests in a very granular and specific way. So you see, we have all sorts of data visualization that is linked to the content that is available on Deep. And again, these are, for example, when we're looking at quality, those are elements that are really needed from a needs assessment point of view for humanitarian stakeholders to really take accurate decisions, so that you know how qualitative valuable is the data that you're relying on when you're taking XY type of decision. And now I'll hand it over to Jean-Baptiste for the part related to machine learning.
And yeah, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I'm Jean-Baptiste, and I studied bioengineering and international development. Then I worked for a couple of years in a company that developed machine learning products and applications. And now I work in an NGO called the Data Friendly Space as the product manager of the Deep. And Data Friendly Space is basically the dedicated NGO that maintains and innovates the platform, even though the Deep is open source and accepts contributions from anybody. And I'm really happy to be here and have the opportunity to present our work and back up Guido, who is an expert in these matters and who actually introduced me to the Deep. So just a quick reminder on the analysis framework that is used in the platform. They're basically designed, as Guido said, to structure the thinking of an analyst and to help logical thinking in a systematic manner. So basically, they're models that guide and facilitate the sense making and understanding when you're processing large amounts of unstructured data. So basically, a good framework ensures that the data is structured in a way that actually facilitates analysis and outcomes that are tangible. So it answers to some questions that can be like, what are the key priority needs, and what are the current gaps in the humanitarian response. So Guido really talked about the Deep workflow extensively, so I'm just going to go very briefly on it right now. So how do the users use the platform? There is the input phase where they upload the leads and the documents. Then there is the processing phase where the the tagging happens, and finally the output, which is an expert, which is then used to conduct analysis outside of the deep based on the entries that you have tagged and selected. So about the input phase, adding leads to a project. This is a screenshot of the connectors feature that Guido mentioned, and here basically users they connect directly to humanitarian portals, for example, that publish thousands of reports every month. So here the real challenge is that users they need to read through a lot of material before they actually find the right information. There is a lot of noise, especially because many reports they repeat the results from other original reports, but users actually they just need to retain that same information once in their project to avoid the duplication and redundancy. So what is a good source? A good source of information from a deep perspective is a source that can potentially generate a large number of entries according to the analytical framework that you're using, that you're then going to use to make analysis. So from a user perspective, it's actually quite painful to go through all this material before you find the right information. And this is one dimension where NLP, as you can imagine, can contribute a lot in, for example, generating an estimate when you upload a lead of how many potential entries you can generate based on the analytical framework you're using. I'm going to go deeper in that later. And the next slide. So this is about the processing phase. As Guido showed, you're going to drag and drop portions of text and then tag them. But this is a very laborious process, as you can imagine, because users usually they first read the whole document once, they understand the context, and then they start tagging. But to start tagging, you need first to know how to use the deep, which is quite challenging, to be honest with you. And then you also need domain knowledge, because you cannot tag randomly. You really need to think about what you're tagging and to actually produce a quality output. So there as well, machine learning and NLP techniques can help the user in tagging better. This is an example of a tagging that you can do, and all the tags and labels that you can assign. And the last step of the process is the output. So this is just a screenshot of the export page of the deep, and as you can see, there are a lot of functionalities. There are a lot of filters. It's not very user friendly, to be honest with you, but the whole idea is that here we can use NLP to avoid redundancy in the export and to actually ensure that the user is exporting a minimum amount of information that is then going to be used to conduct analysis. This is an example of a word export from the deep. As you can see, there is metadata on the entry, and the entry is already inside the structure of the analytical framework that has been used to do the tagging. So let's go to the last step. The final goal, let's not forget about it, is to conduct informed analysis and to actually generate a report based on the entries that you have selected, and you can maybe use this report to secure funding that you will then use to implement your programs during a crisis. But all this is done outside the deep, and we will look more into how we want to integrate it and how we can use NLP to facilitate this integration. So here is just a recap of some of the biggest challenges of using the deep. So it's about the quality of the tagging. You need domain knowledge to actually produce good outputs. You need a lot of time. You need to read a lot of stuff. You can generate a lot of duplicates. There is this problem of redundancy, and you need to spend a lot of time actually cleaning your exports. So what did we do to solve these challenges? Okay, I'm going to start talking about this first implementation of NLP that we did a couple of years ago that we started, and we encountered a lot of problems, to be honest with you. I'm not going to say everything went well and smoothly while we tried to integrate AI in the platform, because it's not really what happened. And actually we had to take it down after a few months of very bad user feedback. But I mean, that's the point of this discussion, is to look at where we failed and why. So first we started with this document clustering feature. And we did this with researchers from universities. So the offline work that we did was very promising and was working really well. But when we deployed this feature in the deep, we ran into scalability issues, because users often, especially when they use the connectors feature, they upload hundreds of documents at the same time in the platform. And this can be a problem, especially because we were running everything on local servers hosted by the CERNs, because it was free for us at that time. So we had big scalability issues. So this is the assisted tagging feature that we used for the processing phase of the deep. So as you can see, logistics 17% confidence. It's not a really high accuracy. That's not really good. And I put this here for a reason, and it's because it's to show that basically our work was based on supervised approaches only, because at that time the resources we had were able to do that, and they didn't know much about deep learning and transformers and BERT and stuff like that. So basically the point is that the logistic class in our database was underrepresented, because it's just not tagged a lot by taggers when they worked inside the deep. And this led to accuracy and performance issues, because your model, when you're using supervised learning, of course, it's just going to be good as your data is, right? So we had problems here from a user perspective, because this feature became it generated inefficiencies, because users did not trust the model at some point. So they spent almost more time checking the results of the model than doing actual work on the deep. So this is a very big issue. Let's move to the other features. This is another thing we explored, which is extractive summarization and key sentences extraction. It worked really well, even when we deployed it. But what we discovered here is that it was actually not really useful from a user perspective. We tried to gather some feedback, and users did not really use it and did not really want to use it, because they did not see any value in it. It was simply faster for them to look at the preview of a document and read the first paragraph than to look at the output of this model that was extracting the most relevant sentences in a document. So here the mistake we made is that basically we did not do enough user research before we jumped into implementation. So here are some challenges that I selected for this talk. But yeah, the main idea is that in the beginning we underestimated at how costly it would be. For example, in terms of computations, the project. We were hosted, as I told you, in these free servers inside the CERN in Switzerland infrastructure, because it was free for us at that time. But we quickly realized that we could not do what we wanted there, and we had to migrate everything to AWS and to serverless. And then we started spending a lot of money in computations. Also, we were working mostly with researchers from universities, and that was our model back then. And we did not realize the whole spectrum of skills that we actually needed to implement this project. We had NLP researchers, but we didn't have data engineers, we didn't have API designers, we didn't have cloud architects, and so on. So this led to some issues. All right, and then from a user perspective, I've mentioned these problems that we had when we were actually implementing the algorithm. When it comes to sensitive data, here, just imagine, it's a very common problem in humanitarian applications of big data, very transversal. Imagine you're dealing with the results of surveys conducted with refugees that are fleeing war zones and seeking protection. What do you do if, for example, the Russian government asks your cloud provider data on those refugees, for example, from Ukraine? Well, there is not an easy answer, but I know from some colleagues in the UNHCR, for example, that they are negotiating some sort of immunity deal with their cloud provider to avoid these issues. And the point here is that you need to think about these things before you jump into implementation. Let's move to the next slide, please, Guido. So yeah, this is just a thing I found funny and very connected to our project, is that we really underestimated the gap there is in between doing offline research work and actually deploying AI pipelines inside the deep. Next slide. So here are some lessons learned. The first one, never underestimate deployment. We understood that we needed more machine learning ops in our project and maybe a bit less of NLP researchers. This is a very basic graph of the architecture that is actually needed to implement machine learning projects. And to be honest with you, we just had maybe half of the AI part. So this was good for us because we learned a lot. Let's look at the other lessons learned. Yes, so from a user research perspective, this is something that we also underestimated a lot. It's really, it's really fancy to look into NLP. It's really nice to say that you are implementing NLP. Everybody talks about it and everybody wants it, but that is also a trap because you need to know what you want before you actually start and what kind of value you want to produce with NLP. And this is not an obvious answer. Actually, to know that answer, you need to go back to fundamental user research. You need to talk to your users. You need to share with them how you think you could use NLP and ask them if it would actually make sense for them and if it would actually make their life easier what you're doing. So this is also something that we're retaining for this first implementation. So second implementation that we're starting right now with a bit more solid basis. We have identified exactly what we want to do because we spent a few months doing user research. And so we want to act on the input dimension of the deep. And this means that we would like to look into how we can assess the leads when they are uploaded and use NLP to actually output this estimate that I mentioned before on the potential entries that can be created out of a lead based on an analytical framework. Then when it comes to the leads multi-tagging, here as well we are looking into unsupervised approaches. We are looking into multilingual transformers such as BERT, because we believe that they can help us in mitigating the problems related to the quantity of the data, but most importantly to the quality of the data, because as I mentioned before, tagging on the deep really requires domain knowledge. So change of technology, but also change in strategy. When we will roll out the assisted, we want to focus on building trust from the users to the model. So this means that in terms of user experience, at first, the model will only be queried when the user thinks he or she needs it, when he doesn't know how to tag, for example, or the model will intervene when the model believes that the user is wrong. So it will provide a recommendation that the user will either accept or reject. And then on a second rollout, when we believe that we've established this trust because the models are actually working thanks to the upgrading technology, we will go to completely automated tagging, where the users actually function as a quality controller for the model that does the tagging. So there the user will not spend time reading the whole document and will be able to focus more on analysis, which is the most important part. And the third feature that we're working on is actually the cleaning of the exports to avoid this redundancy problem that I mentioned before. So looking at entries that say the same thing, but in different ways, You don't need 10 of them, you just need one. And we would like to use NLP to actually clean these exports. All right. What's next as well on our research topics? We would like to explore topic modeling to add another layer of classification, because first, entries are classified based on the analytical framework that is being used. But then inside those labels and the tags, you also have entries that actually tell the same story. For example, about how COVID is impacting poverty in the food security sector. So you want to group those entries together, those that tell the same story, because based on that story, the analyst will create an analytical statement that is then used to make decisions in a crisis context. Then we want to look into text generation and abstractive summarization, because we would like to include this analysis phase inside the DEEP, because it's currently done outside the DEEP, but we believe it should be part of the platform. And we will look at how we can automate the generation of analytical statements based on those entries that I mentioned before that tell a similar story. And then we would like to look into the assessment registry feature we have, which is designed to create the world's richest needs assessment database. So needs assessment are a very important document in these circumstances, because they are the most strict in terms of research methods, and they provide a lot of extremely useful information. And we would like to use that information to actually look into predictive analysis and how to automate needs analysis and humanitarian response plans.
This is the website of the DEEP. You need to create an account to log into the application. You just click here. I think there was a couple of colleagues that have as well asked about tutorials and learning. If you go on the learning button on the top right corner, you actually access a lot of online trainings, resources, tutorials. There's even a YouTube channel that you can continue exploring the usage of DEEP, and as well, not only the application itself, because again, what we want to put emphasis on is not only the tool, because nowadays having a tool is relatively easy, but what is really important for us, and that's where we're putting a lot of energy and time, is really to have analysts get trained and people and colleagues scale up their understanding of the spectrum, for example, the structural analytical techniques, the usage and the implementation of analytical frameworks. We really want to put emphasis on those pillars that will then ease the deployment of any tool that is actually existing on the ecosystem. There is a lot of tools, proprietary solutions that are existing that are looking at qualitative and quantitative secondary data online that you have to pay for a fee to access them, which actually do a very good job, to be quite frank. But what we are really building here is a collaborative approach to analysis, so that all the stakeholders that I've showed you before here that are available on the website as well can actually collaborate and coordinate. And the more time we save on those aspects as well, we're saving humanitarian funding, and we could allocate that funding to other initiatives and other activities, because at the end of the day, what we are trying to build is an information system that can support decision making, that can actually, in a more timely manner, help those who have been affected by a disaster or by a crisis. So once you're logged in, this is how DEEP looks like. I will take an example of the current ongoing project that IMAP has with Data Friendly Space for Syria. So basically, here we can see that these are all the documents that have been ingested. You can actually filter and do a lot of research on who you want, what you want to export and what you want to see. And then basically, for example, here, I do not have the rights to do any action. I do not have the rights to basically go and ingest information. I can actually just view information. But here you would have a little button that would tell you, okay, let's go and do the tagging. And if you look at the entries, so this is the piece of text that has been ingested into the analytical framework. Basically, if we go here, well, you obviously needs internet to be functional, but it's actually taking some time because there's a lot of information. And here you can see that the pieces of information that have been tagged, and then you have all the metadata that has been added. What are the type of demographic groups that this piece of information refers to, the reliability, the severity of the piece of information, how does this break down geographically, what are the other sectorial information that are available. And you see each piece of information has different tagging and different metadata assigned to it, because it's based on the piece of information itself. And then in the export, you can go here and apply all of those filters to your queries, and you can actually here expand on how you want to structure your export based on all the parameters that have been ingested in the system. And then you can select if you want a Word, PDF, Excel, or a JSON API connector. And then you get the raw document. Now the raw document is really the structured information that you've been able to summarize. And if we look at how much data we have in this project, we basically are looking at 900 documents ingested in the system, with 7,500 pieces of information structured against the analytical framework, which means that we have a huge database, in this case for Syria, to be able to structure then the analytical output. The analytical output goes through a whole series of structured analytical techniques that basically make you then generate a product that looks like this one here. This is the situation analysis that is basically covering between September and October, 4 weeks of work. Then this is looking at the coverage of the tagging of data in that period. But then the publication of this report occurs on the 10th day of the following month. So on the 10th of November, this document was issued, and we gave ourselves basically 2.5 weeks of time to really do all the structure analytical techniques, work as a team to make sure that we're following the spectrum and we're looking at shared levels of analysis, and then actually write the report and come up with the analytical conclusion. And this is, as you can see, every month we're issuing a report for 6 countries. Syria is one of them, that is looking at 50, 60, 70 pages of analysis of what is actually happening in these countries, and what is the impact and what are the secondary impacts of COVID-19 in regards to humanitarian challenging contexts such as Syria or Colombia, for example. And you see that these pieces are all basically coming from your raw export of deep, so it facilitates a lot. But then all of the compilation of the report and the analytical output generation and the added value really sits and relies on triangulating the information with the teams on the ground and looking at shared levels of analysis so that interpretation actually has a meaningful outcome.